I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. So this paper is an empirical paper, and it's work that has been ongoing with a couple of co-authors, Grace Kumchulesi, who's currently an economist at the Malawi National Planning Commission, and Martine Mariotti, who is an economic historian at Australian National University. And so this paper, it's going to connect with the labor part of our theme and hopefully the structural transformation part of our theme. It's not going to have much to say about home production, at least in this paper. It's about labor migration, capital accumulation, and the structure of rural labor markets. And we're going to do this in the context of Malawi. So the motivation for this paper sort of starts a big picture motivation, thinking about this key question in development economics. What do rural areas need for labor markets to diversify, for labor to shift out of relatively low productivity agriculture into higher productivity other sectors? So what are the kinds of things that can trigger a shift in moving workers from one sector to the other through the structural transformation? And so from a theoretical perspective, capital accumulation has always been an important component or part of that process of allowing workers to shift out of low productivity agriculture. But in many sub-Saharan African countries, the key triggers, the sort of usual suspects that you think about that could actually lead to capital accumulation, so industrial revolutions or trade revolutions or green revolutions, those usual suspects are not present. And so what we are trying to do in this paper is think about whether communities getting access to capital or the ability to accumulate capital through international migration could possibly be a trigger for structural change in the labor market over the long run. I'm going to address this question in the context of Malawi. We're going to use a natural experiment to actually measure what happens in response to what I'm going to argue is reasonably exogenous, large shocks to the ability to migrate across countries out of Malawi and back to Malawi, and look at how that natural experiment sort of, how the implications of that natural experiment play out over 3 decades after the migration actually ends. And an important part of what we're going to look at in this paper is not just the labor migration, but the capital accumulation that is facilitated through this movement of labor across space. We're going to try and highlight the central role of labor migration in shaping labor markets in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll come back and show you a picture that hopefully will intrigue you about this particular aspect of work on the continent. Our paper is going to try to present some evidence on structural change in this particular labor market, a place where data are pretty scant. And so we're going to put together a lot of different data from archival searches, digitizing old census data and agricultural census reports to try and piece together what happens over a period of about 40 years in the wake of this international labor migration shock. And just to give you a heads up, a reminder, for those of you who've forgotten where Malawi is, here's a map of Africa. Malawi's right there, landlocked, very small, very poor. It's reasonably low population. In the 1960s, there's about 3.5 million. Today, it's about 18 million people. So it's a pretty small, very poor country. And what we're going to find when we look at this natural experiment is that the money that's coming back to Malawi into different parts of the country as a result of these shocks to labor migration, areas that get more access to this migrant capital are going to see larger shifts out of agriculture in about 3 decades. And we're going to find differential impacts for men and for women. We're going to see actually there's a larger impact on the female shift out of agriculture relative to men. And then we're going to try and empirically try and shed some light for the mechanisms through which this returning migrant capital affected labor markets over the longer run. So we're going to look for evidence for impacts on agricultural investments. We're going to find nothing. We're going to look for impacts on investments in non-agricultural spaces. There's going to be a little bit of evidence there. And then this is something that should make Tommaso pretty happy. We're going to find some evidence that an important mechanism for this shift is likely going through the human capital channel through education. And so we think that's an important channel through which this large shock to labor migration and influx of capital affected labor markets over the long run. Okay, so you might be thinking, why are you focusing on migrant capital? So from the development perspective, accessing capital, we know for many different reasons is difficult and has historically been difficult in developing countries. In the last 10, 15 years, there have been a large number of randomized controlled trials at individual level or at individual business level trying to assess the impact of sort of dropping more capital on small businesses or on individuals. Ours is a different kind of experiment. Ours is a natural experiment where we're looking at capital injections that are happening into local labor markets. So all of the outcomes that we're going to be measuring are, except for the human capital outcomes, the outcomes we're going to be measuring are measured at the local labor market level, so within country. Secondly, remittances are, or they were at the end of 2019, remittances across countries are very large and very important sources of capital for a number of very poor countries. So in 2019, if we look at, this is a picture from the World Bank, it actually shows that in 2019, remittances overtook flows of FDI to poor countries around the world, and their projection, at least, was that remittances were going to continue to increase. It's not clear what the COVID shock has done to those now, but this is an important source of capital for a lot of countries. There are several countries where remittances constitute the largest proportion of GDP. And then finally, and this kind of comes back to providing scant evidence for a sub-Saharan African context, South-South labor migration is really important and has been important for a long time in many African countries. And so the migration we're going to talk about is migration of men. It's going to be formal, centralized migration that is organized to work on mines in South Africa. And this kind of migration has been typical throughout the 1900s. In a lot of different countries. So just to give you a sense of, Malawi is not going to be a weird case study that we're looking at here. What this graph is the percent, shows us the percent of adult male workers who were absent from their home country and working as migrant miners on the South African gold mines between 1920 and 1990. And so you can see here, there are a range of different countries where there have been high levels and very large fluctuations in the proportion of men who are missing from the home country. Lesotho is sort of the dominant line over here. You can see very large shifts. At some point, half the men were missing. We're going to focus on, hopefully this looks red to you, this red line down here. This is Malawi. And you can see for a long time there was relatively little international migration to South Africa. We're going to exploit this big jump up and then fall in labor migration. I'll tell you more about that in a couple slides as our natural experiment, and sort of see what the implications of this labor migration and money coming back from migration were in the next decades. So how I want to sort of structure the presentation, I want to give you one snapshot of what labor markets in Malawi kind of look like to try and help you fix ideas. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the natural experiment to give you some of the institutional details that are important for understanding our identification strategy. I'll talk about that and our data, and then present the major results we have for structural shifts in the labor market, and finish up talking about some of the empirical evidence we have on mechanisms. Okay, so what do you need to know about Malawi? This graph is basically showing us over 60 years how employment has shifted across sectors in this country. So the blue bars show us the 1960 values, the orange bars are the more recent values, and you can see that over time the proportion of employment in agriculture has fallen substantially from about 45% to about 30%. Proportion in manufacturing has fallen, and the proportion employed in services has really, really increased. Okay, so this is a pattern that is, not uncommon in a lot of other African settings. What's important to know about agriculture is that agriculture is largely subsistence. It's maize farming, and to some extent export crops. So the big export crop in Malawi was tobacco. And on the service sector side, if you have a look at census data, much of the employment in services is in small-scale retail. or in public schools, so teacher employment. And then also importantly, about 1/3 of non-farm workers are self-employed. Okay, so there's a lot of self-employment in the non-farm sector as well. Okay, so what's interesting about Malawi in this particular natural experiment? The type of migration we're going to be looking at, as I said, is formal migration. It's organized by the labor recruiting agency of the South African mines, which was called the Witwatersrand Native Labor Association. And Malawi was one country out of many that actually had a large number of recruiting agencies set up throughout the country as early as the 1900s to sort of tap the flow of men to work in unskilled jobs on South African gold mines. So until 1967 or so in Malawi, what happened was that there were labor quotas that Malawi was presented with. The South African gold mines basically said, we need X number of men. Malawi said, well, here's your quota. And this quota is kind of ticking up over time. So men were recruited through these recruiting agencies that were in some districts and not others. And that migration increased sort of slowly over time. What happened in 1967, or 66, is that Malawi gained independence. And then in 1967, the new president said, we are removing all of those labor quotas. We are now no longer going to restrict the number of men who can leave for the South African gold mines. And you can see what happens post 1967. There's a massive increase in the number of men leaving to go and work on these mines. So what's important about these jobs? Two things are important. One is, this is contractual work. So these men were away for 2 years at a time and were required to come back to the country. They were required to come back to the country in order to access their payments. So the way the contracts were written was that the majority of the wages earned on the mines were only returned to the worker once they got home. And so that's an important reason why we're able to collect archival data on how much money was being sent back to these different communities in different years. In 1974, April 1974, you can see a big decline starting in labor migration. What happened was a plane that was returning international migrants back to Malawi crashed. All the miners aboard were killed. And President Banda said, all right, we're shutting down migration. We're going to shut down this international migration entirely. Everyone who's in South Africa has to come back and no one else can leave. And so what happens in about the 7-year period is a massive increase in migration, a lot of money coming back, and then a shutdown of this channel. In 1977, the president realizes, wait, this was not such a great idea because it just shut down our second most important source of foreign exchange. We'll let you guys go again, but by that time, conditions in South Africa had changed and migration never rebounded to the levels it had before. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have we're gonna collect data on employment in 1977. So right when all of these guys are back, I'm gonna follow forward in time what happens in local labor markets that were differentially affected by this particular shock. So this figure shows us how the increase in labor migration was mirrored by an increase in money coming back into these communities. The two lines basically show us how much was coming back into Malawi in every month of every year. Before 1967, the levels were very low. Between 1967 and the plane crash, you can see that money increasing, and then right after the plane crash, you see a big jump and then a big decline. Okay, so this was about 8% of GDP in 1975, much larger than foreign aid. And for the workers' perspective, it was about $130 to $290 upon return. So this was, I think in our paper we kind of benchmarked this as more than 2 times the annual wage that someone could earn at the next best wage opportunity in Malawi. So it's a highly lucrative kind of activity. So one thing to point out here is we're thinking about how migrant capital can affect the sectoral allocation of labor and how it can affect this allocation for several decades. And so the first way we think money coming back into these communities affects what's going on is through demand. So there's more money. If preferences are non-homothetic, we're going to have a relative higher increase in the demand for non-farm goods. And that's going to pull workers out of the agricultural sector, at least initially, until the money runs out. Okay. At the same time, when there's more money coming into these communities, there's going to be more liquidity and potentially to relax credit constraints, both on farm and potentially off farm. Okay, so we could actually see investments in farm activities improve or in off farm activities improve. And then thirdly, with more liquidity, there's potentially more investment in health and human capital as well, raising the marginal productivity of labor in different sectors in the next generation. Okay, so what we're interested in sort of looking at is whether we can find evidence of accumulation that would explain why this temporary capital shock has persistent effects on the labor market. We're going to provide some evidence for some specific accumulation channels, but we don't think the demand channel is unimportant. We think it's important. We just don't have anything that we can measure in our data to track that down. Okay, so on the empirical strategy side, our setup is pretty straightforward. We're going to be looking at employment in different sectors. We're going to be looking at different types of jobs. That's our outcome. Why? We're measuring everything at the local labor market level, at the district level. We're going to have 4 census years of information. We're going to look at how districts that receive different amounts of money by 1975 changed in the subsequent decades. And importantly, we're going to control for migrants. So what this specification is telling us is we're going to say, let's compare, here's a thought experiment. Let's compare 2 districts who sent the same total number of migrants over the 7-year period, but received different amounts of money in return. Okay, and the way in which a district sending the same number of migrants, but receiving more money for those migrants, the way that happened is essentially related to the time profile of migration. So I'll show you a slide on that in a second. But just to note, we're going to control for local labor market fixed effects, for decade fixed effects. We're going to control for a set of baseline historical district covariates interacted with trend because we don't have any information on employment sectors in 1966. The census didn't capture this. So anything that's different across these districts historically related to population density or literacy, or other factors that could affect how the labor market is changing, we're going to try and control for that with these covariates interacted with trend. So our identification assumption here is conditional on the covariates, including this control for total number of migrants. Districts with different amounts of capital would have changed in the same way in the absence of these capital inflows. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, what drives spatial variation in these migrant capital shocks? Basically the time profile of migration. So what happened during the 7-year period was that the international gold price was increasing substantially. And what this did was it led the South African mines to raise wages of workers. And so if you were a migrant who started early in the period, you earned less than $100 for your time abroad. If you started later in the period, you earned more than 4 times that amount. And so the same total number of migrants could actually generate more money coming into certain districts depending on that time profile. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. So let me tell you a little bit about the data. So as I said, we collected archival data on remittances. We've got administrative records of the recruiting organization documenting the money flows by month, year, district, and type of flow. We had bunches of RAs working in different countries. This was the archives in Zomba, which we were very, very happy to find these data and then quickly digitize it before the documents disintegrated. And then we combined that information with baseline controls from digitized census data in the 1940s, 1960s. We collect a bunch of other outcomes from later census years, including urban shares and population densities. And then we put together a series of information on accumulation outcomes from agricultural census data, regular income expenditure survey data, and then some DHS data, which I'm not going to have time to show you today. So we put all this together, and what I'm going to show you is basically a couple pictures of how employment shifted across sectors in the high and low capital shock districts, and then I'll show you our main results with all the controls included. So structural change across the districts with high and low amounts of capital coming back in. What you see on the left is the share of women in agriculture, and on the right, the share of women in services. Runs from 1977 through 2008. and the dark line is the high capital shock districts. So you can see here that all of these districts are being affected in some way or other by this migration. It's very prevalent throughout the country. All of these districts see women shifting out of agriculture, but that shift is larger in the high capital shock districts, okay? And the shift into services is larger to a high level in the high capital shock districts. For men, you see a similar picture, but it kind of starts a little bit earlier. So you see men shift out of agriculture a little bit earlier than women, and a shift into services a little bit earlier as well in the high capital relative to the low capital shock districts. So this is without any controls. So I'm going to show you our results now with all the controls, but just to sort of fix magnitudes here, the average amount of money coming back into each district was about $2.25 million. And we're going to look at outcomes separately by gender. We're going to deal with our standard errors in the way to take account of the small number of districts as well. So here's our results for women. So what this graph is showing us, the different bars show us the shares of employment in agriculture, in manufacturing, and in services for each of the decades after the end of the migration shock. So these are estimates of the alpha parameter that's on the interaction of our decade dummies and the amount of money coming back in to the district, controlling for all of our other covariates. And what you see here is that for women, in districts with an extra $1 million coming in, agricultural employment goes down by about 1 percentage point 2 decades after, and then a further 1 percentage point 3 decades after. And this shift, or this reallocation of employment, is really into the service sector. Okay, there's nothing much going on with manufacturing for women. You can also see that for women, these are fairly precisely estimated, at least in the second and the third decade after. For men, the picture is a little bit more mixed, a little bit more muted. Remember, we're controlling here for the total number of migrants as well. So this is conditional on the number of male migrants sent. Does male employment shift differentially in high versus low capital shock districts? We don't see much strong evidence that there's a big shift out of agriculture for men. There's maybe a little shift into the service sector 2 decades post, but not precisely estimated 3 decades after. Okay. I'm going to leave that for the discussion in case this comes up. I want to tell you a little bit about what these service sector jobs look like. So we are able to break down the different components of the service sector, and we see where capital inflows were larger, men shifted into construction, retail, transport, and communications. Women did, and then men to some extent shifted into construction and retail at least 2 decades after. This is something Rachel might be interested in. In the high capital inflow districts, you see women shift to be family business workers. So they look like they're working more in the family business. Men also shift into family business work, but they tend to be they report themselves as self-employed. So women are not doing the same thing. So what about magnitudes? Well, the average district received $2.25 million in deferred pay. If we add this up, if we sort of compound this across the 3 decades of response, it looks like the average district had about 975 more non-farm jobs by 2008, which makes the cost per service sector job about $1,000. And if we wanted to put our results a little bit in context with the overall shift out of farming from 77 to 2008. And if we think that migrant capital inflows are generating some portion of this shift, it looks like for women, almost 20% of the decline in agricultural employment is coming from being exposed to this higher capital inflow related to international labor migration. So what's important, I think, here is that we're picking up market level impacts. This is not just impacts for migrant families, it's for the whole local labor market. And secondly, it's not just about returning minors. Okay, the results that we're finding that are precisely estimated are for women. Women were not minors. And the results that are persistent in the second and third decade are for the next generation of workers. They're not for the generation that was directly involved in making labor market choices around the mining shock. So with that in mind, how much time do I have left, Rachel? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So that's enough time to give you a highlight of what we find on regarding evidence on the persistence of accumulation, or the mechanisms for the persistence of these results. Here our identification strategy obviously uses the capital shock conditional on the number of migrants, but we're lucky enough that we can actually measure outcomes at the district level for each of the channels. So we're gonna look first of all at investment outcomes in agriculture, and the outcomes that we can measure in agricultural census data are limited. So we can't measure anything like fertilizer, but we can measure the share of households that have hoes or pangas or cattle. And so these are key inputs into farming in Malawi. And so what we're looking for is, does it look like districts that had more money coming in, conditional on the migrants and the other covariates, does it look like those farmers actually own any of this capital at higher rates? And it's true, you know, we don't have a lot of data. We just have I think 3 agricultural census waves. We don't see any big differences in the ownership of these capital equipment or capital investments, agricultural investments. And that's not surprising. If you know anything about farming in Malawi, land markets are highly distorted. Everyone has a tiny piece of land, and so and there's not a lot of capital used on these farms anyway. So we don't see that there's any kind of consolidation. We don't see there's any kind of investment in farm capital. In terms of non-farm capital, what we looked at was ownership of radios, whether your house has a durable roof and whether your house has durable roof and walls. And we look at this controlling for pre-values and then looking 3 decades after. What we find is that in districts with more money coming in, households are much more likely to own radios immediately after, and a decade after, they're more likely to have a durable roof and walls. Okay, so sometimes these are the kinds of outcomes we might think about as measuring on the consumption side, like households are just spending on their consumption. But at the same time, if households are running family businesses, retail businesses that have inventory, investing in your home is actually an investment in your business as well, protecting your inventory. So we think that, as other authors have argued, investment in your housing quality is probably part consumption and part investment. And then the final piece of evidence we have on mechanisms is that human capital investments increased in the next generation. So the way that we're going to do this is taking you back to one of the first slides I showed you about the increase in migrant money coming in. We can line up these increases in the periods of time when they happened with different cohorts that were eligible to be in primary school around the time that this money was coming back. So we're going to define 4 cohorts: the control cohorts, who were already out of school by the time the money started coming back; surge cohorts that were eligible for primary school when the money was coming back; ban cohorts, which are those individuals eligible to be in primary school right after the ban was put in place and there was a big increase in money coming back; and then post cohorts, which were just a couple years afterwards. And we're going to compare what happens to education for boys and girls, or for men and women. We're observing them in adulthood. What happens for education for men and women in districts that receive different amounts of migrant money for each of these different cohorts. Okay. So let me just show you the results here. What we find is that education increases, and it increases for females and for males, although relatively more for females than for males. So you can see here the level of education is pretty low in Malawi, and on average for women it's 1.8 years, for men it's 3.2 years. Only a third of adult females have been to primary school, almost a half of men. And what you see here is estimates for the interaction of the amount of migrant money coming back and interacted with your cohort. And so all of these coefficients are large relative to base. They're strongly significant. What that suggests is that for an additional $1 million coming back in, that buys about between 0.1 and 0.4 more years of education for women. So relatively, that's about a 7% increase in educational attainment for women, about a 4% increase in attainment for men. And so what we think is that, and this is not a model paper. This is just an empirical, almost like a proof of concept paper that this happened in Malawi. What we think is going on is that these shifts into the service sector that we're seeing more for women than for men are linked to what's going on in education. All of these individuals are gaining more education in response to this infusion of money coming from migrants, but this impact is having, or the increase is impacting women relatively more than men. Okay, so wrapping up. What we're able to show in this paper is that there's a persistent shift out of agricultural employment into service employment in districts in Malawi receiving more migrants, conditional on the number of migrants who were sent. We think that migrant capital inflows account for between 5 and 19% of the structural shift out of farming in this country over about 40 years. And the cost of an additional service sector job is about $1,000. A lot of these jobs in the service sector are in construction, in retail, transport, and communications. And it looks like the effects for women are larger and more precise. We think that the mechanisms here are that when the money came back, families invested more in human capital. Families may have invested more in non-farm capital. It doesn't look like they invested that money into farm capital at all. And we think that although this is a particular historical event, we think that because of the prevalence of labor migration within the Southern African region, this is a potential development policy tool. To the extent that labor migration is temporary, it's circular, it's organized and formalized, and there's a way of channeling resources back to the sending country, this is possibly a development tool for those countries that are resource poor, but population rich, like Malawi. So I will stop there. I don't know if I think I'm kind of at time, and I'm happy to take questions. None of my co-authors could be with us today, unfortunately, so I can't give them any of the questions. But thanks for listening.
Thank you, Taryn. So there was no question in the chat room, so I guess people are going to ask directly. I saw Michael is getting ready.
Oh, yeah, one thing Mariolina said that any of us who are presenters don't have the ability to raise our hands in the Zoom, so you should just jump in.
I'm going to let Joe go first because otherwise he's complaining against that the Yale guys don't let anyone speak. So Joe.
Sorry, no, I was just kidding with that. I was curious about this is obviously like a small part of your results, but 30 years later you have this negative results on radios. Is it at all possible that that's like actually a movement to TVs or anything like that?
Yeah, so we think we do think that that's what's going on. We can't measure TV in earlier decades. We only have TV basically in in 2008. But yeah, I think that's what's going on.
But I think it would be neat to look at the later things in terms of thinking of the persistence of this effect. You know, if you looked at cell phones or TVs and you, at a later date, it's obvious that that's not what the money originally went for, but it could show a persistent effect.
Well, so one thing we do show, and I didn't show you here, was we look at demographic health survey data and look at asset ownership to try and get a sense of, are the communities that received more money in this period, do they look like they're wealthier 15 years later? And we do find that's the case. So basically there is some evidence that there's persistence in where this money lands. It looks like these communities have higher asset values later on, or measures of assets on the demographic health surveys 15 years later. And
then one more question is just on the table with the human capital investments. You mentioned that it's related to your AEJ applied. If that was the case, the AEJ applied was looking at sort of like direct impacts on human capital, and this is looking at impacts on human capital through this money?
Right, so the other paper basically looked just at, we used we used the same shock, but we were using the data kind of in a different way, looking at differences across recruiting station districts and non-recruiting station districts. And so there, we weren't able to separate out sort of how much of the education effect is coming from money and how much is coming from the migrants actually going and coming back. Yeah. Because you can imagine that when migrants leave, if there's 20, I didn't mention the statistic, but at the height of the shock, 20% of the male labor force was actually missing from Malawi. And so this was a big, there was a lot of spatial heterogeneity. Some districts had more than half of their men missing. This has implications for child labor. And so we weren't actually sure whether, during the shock, whether this would have increased child labor and so crowded out schooling with long-term effects, or whether it actually crowded in or, led to these income effects that would have increased schooling. So in that paper, we kind of focused more on that distinction. And I think we didn't actually have the remittance data in a shape to use at that point. And so in this paper, we're focused really on saying, well, how much difference did the money make? How much difference did it make that these districts were getting, conditional on the number of migrants, were actually getting more money, enabling families to send their kids to school? Because during this time, school was not free. School was expensive. And so this would have been releasing a constraint on that kind of an investment for families.
Well, now that you have the slide up here and you already talked about the constraints, I have a question. So I was sort of surprised that the coefficient on the interaction is reasonably similar between the surge and the ban and the post cohorts. I wonder, were you guys expecting to find something different? The reason why I'm saying this is I would have expected for the ban cohorts, to the extent that these migration instances are sort of persistent over time, right? That, if you see your brother, I don't know, go to South Africa, you're also going to South Africa, you would, and these jobs are very profitable. You would think for some communities, this is a big loss in permanent income, right? This presumably was sort of something you've been looking forward to for the next 10 years. And so now you have this loss in permanent income. And so the fact that even for the band cohort, you find this increase in educational expenditure seems to suggest that these credit constraints are kind of very important, and it's all about liquidity getting people into schools. But I don't know, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why these coefficients are so similar.
So two things. One is actually in the other paper where we did like more of the reduced form, we just looked at the shock across different recruiting and non-recruiting station districts. We tested for the difference between the surge and the ban cohorts, because especially because during the surge, money's coming back, but the men are away. Whereas during the ban, men are back and money is back. And so there's sort of different, the substitution effect kind of works in different directions in those two periods, even if the income effect is pushing everyone in the same way. And so in that paper, we did find that the ban cohort has a larger effect. Those two coefficients were different. We didn't do it here, actually, we should. But in terms of the liquidity, yes, it's really expensive relative to what people are earning in Malawi to send their kids to school. Both school fees, uniforms, textbooks, etc., are all important. And also families are large. So if you have 8 kids in your family, that becomes pretty expensive. In terms of like, if your permanent income gets shocked, do you suddenly pull your kid out of school? The level of schooling that these kids are sort of at the margin of making a choice about, this is primary schooling, right? So this is not you're deciding to pull your kid out of 5th grade or 6th grade and send them to the market. These are, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. And so I think maybe that's also why we're still seeing positive effects here. The money that comes back is very substantial relative to what these individuals could earn if they were farming in tobacco, for example, back home. So
there's a question from Mansour. Mansour, can you please ask that?
Okay, sure. So yeah, I left this on the chat. So I find the structural transformation induced by this capital injection is very interesting and at the same time convincing. So I have a quick question on the quality of job in agriculture and service in Malawi. So do workers in service, do they enjoy the higher wage and or the higher satisfaction compared to the agricultural sector? The reason why I'm asking this question is it matters for the aggregate welfare, the consequences.
Right, so that's a good question. I didn't have this in our slides here. What we did with, I think it was household income expenditure survey data, was we tried to compute what the value added was in farming versus the value added in working in a non-farm business. So a lot of this is self-employed non-farm business. And we see that it's higher at this household level, higher in the non-farm business than in agriculture. And so to that extent, even if services, so you might think that, being in retail in Malawi may not seem like such a great job, but relative to, subsistence farming maize, it's still better than doing that. So it seemed like there's some evidence that, value added in those non-agricultural jobs, service sector jobs, is higher than in agriculture.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a question from Kyle Emmerich, who raised the hand. Kyle, do you want to ask directly? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk, Taryn. I'm kind of curious about the agricultural sector, kind of beyond some of the stuff you showed on farm mechanization, and wondering if there's a potential to look at things like land reallocation or aggregate agricultural production to get a sense about what happened in some of these communities on those types of outcomes, or should we be thinking about kind of a surplus labor type of thing that was present beforehand?
So thanks for the question, Kyle. I wouldn't put this slide as any evidence on mechanization in Malawi. That would be overly generous, I think. We tried really hard to comb the historical agricultural census data, or at least the published reports, to get us a sense of what else we could measure, fertilizer use or average size of farm or something like that. And there's just there's nothing that goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s, unfortunately. They have, there's good agricultural surveys from much more recent years, from the 2000s onwards. I don't know how I feel about, actually, I don't feel very comfortable just focusing on those. I would really want to see kind of what's happening around, the time this is happening, and trace it through over time. But I do think that land markets and the various constraints to consolidating land is potentially very important in places like Malawi, in terms of the way that this structural transformation happens or doesn't happen.
Right. We have a few more minutes. Joe, your hand is still raised. Do you have more questions, Joe?
Rachel, can I ask a question? I cannot raise my hand.
Of course.
Unless Joe doesn't. Hi, Taryn. So, well, first, extremely interesting paper. I have actually a very basic clarification question on the result, kind of the sectoral reallocation by gender. I have two. First, have you tried just if you pull everything to both male and female together, what do you get? And then the second one, kind of related, is this conditional on working? So do you measure agricultural employment as a share of all women or all men in the labor force, or it is just unconditional, just as a share of the population?
Okay, so we measure this as a share of the population, so not on the employment margin, but employment participation is very high in Malawi. So about 80% of women are working throughout the period. I can't remember offhand the number for men. But yeah, so we're measuring it relative to the population. We're not looking at shifts into and out of employment, although employment participation is very high. And in terms of pooling men and women, do you have in mind just interacting for gender differences, pulling everything together, or just looking at the overall effect for men and women?
I was thinking just the overall effect, because somehow it makes sense that if women have a comparative advantage out of agriculture and into kind of skill accumulation, as I think there is some evidence on this developing countries. So it actually, these results will be consistent, and then you can look from the aggregate and then show in the aggregate there is structural transformation, and then actually it comes more from women than from men. Yeah, which is kind of consistent with them having comparative advantage. Somehow it tells us something I think extremely interesting, also in gender differences, at least at this stage of development. So I don't know, maybe you can just interpret it as there's not enough power to look at males, but I was just thinking I don't know.
So we could do that easily. I feel like I must have done that at some point in the past. It just escapes me. But yeah, we could do that. That would be a kind of a nice way of framing what's going on for the differences across across men and women as well. That should be relatively easy to try.
Thanks.